Welcome, dear friends, and let me take you on a journey through a tale of love's resilience, a story of how two souls endured unimaginable hardship and injustice, only to have fate grant them a second chance at happiness. It's a story where love defies all odds, even when hope seems lost. This is the story of Emma Hartley and Liam Parker. Jonathan Carter, a man with wealth and power, stood towering in the penthouse suite, his face red and pulsating with fury. His grip tightened around a manila envelope, his knuckles turning white as he paced angrily across the room. His veins bulged, a stark contrast to the sophisticated suit he wore. He was a man used to control, but today, that control was slipping through his fingers. "Emma!" Jonathan bellowed, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged penthouse, the walls almost trembling from the force of his rage. "Get your lying, cheating self in here, right now." Spittle flew from his mouth as he yelled, his face a mask of anger. In the next room, Emma Hartley stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had heard that tone before, the kind of tone that signaled Jonathan was in one of his rages. And when Jonathan raged, someone always paid the price. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air too thin to breathe as she struggled to gather her courage. Knowing she had no choice, Emma stepped into the living room, her back rigid with fear. "What's wrong, Jonathan?" she asked tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands unconsciously smoothed the silk robe she wore, a nervous habit she couldn't shake when she felt vulnerable. Jonathan turned to her, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. He ripped the envelope open with a vicious swipe and threw it aside. From the contents, he pulled out a set of glossy photographs and thrust them into Emma's face, so close she could hardly focus on what they showed. "Care to explain what this is?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. Emma's breath caught in her throat as her eyes focused on the images. There she was, outside the hospital where she volunteered, smiling warmly at Liam Parker, the man who had unknowingly brought a sliver of light back into her dark world. He stood beside her in the photo, handing her a modest bouquet of daisies, her favorite flower. The joy on her face, a joy that Jonathan had never been able to bring her, was now frozen in time, captured by the incriminating lens. Jonathan's sharp tone pulled her out of her reverie. "Who is he?" he demanded, his words laced with contempt. "What's his profession?" "Start talking, Emma." Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? How could she explain that Liam was a kind, compassionate ambulance driver, someone who had seen her pain, her loneliness, and had shown her a kind of care that had been absent in her life for so long? But the truth, admitting that she had feelings for another man, would unleash a storm she wasn't sure she could survive. She struggled to find the words as Jonathan stepped closer, grabbing a fistful of her robe and pulling her towards him until their faces were mere inches apart. His breath was hot and suffocating as he hissed, "I'm waiting." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as her mind raced back to the day Jonathan entered her life, 12 years earlier. She had been a struggling artist, barely able to make ends meet. The crushing weight of her father's death in a tragic car accident had left her not only heartbroken, but financially ruined. Medical bills had piled up, hundreds of thousands of dollars she could never hope to repay. That's when Jonathan had swooped in like a vulture. He had offered her a solution, but at a terrible price. He would pay off her debts, allow her to bury her father with dignity, but only if she agreed to become his wife, a marriage built not on love, but on a sinister transaction. And worse, he had whispered dark hints that her father's accident may not have been an accident at all, insinuating that any refusal could result in more unfortunate accidents. Terrified and without options, Emma had given in. Now, standing here, Jonathan's hand gripping her robe like a vice, Emma knew she had to tell him something. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "His name is Liam," she stammered. "He's an ambulance driver, someone I met at the hospital." Jonathan's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "An ambulance driver? How precious." His tone dripped with condescension. "And what?" You thought you two could have a future together? He'll never be able to give you what I can. Emma shivered under his gaze, feeling like a possession more than a person. But despite her fear, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. I have feelings for him, she whispered. But we've never been physical, I swear. The confession left her trembling, waiting for the storm that she knew was about to come. Jonathan's face contorted with rage, and Emma knew this was only the beginning. 12 years earlier, Emma Hartley had been a different person, full of dreams and ambition. She was on the verge of completing her master's degree in fine arts, with a bright future as an artist ahead of her. She had been close to her father, her only living relative, who had supported her through every step of her education, even when they struggled financially. But tragedy struck, shattering her world in an instant. One evening, her father had waved goodbye to her as he left for what was supposed to be a routine business meeting. She never expected that it would be the last time she'd see him alive. A semi-truck had barreled through a red light, crashing into her father's car at full speed. The impact was devastating, leaving him clinging to life for days. Emma spent sleepless nights by his side, praying for a miracle that never came. When he passed away, Emma was left not only heartbroken, but also drowning in medical debt. The bills amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars, far more than she could ever hope to pay. Emma had been young and utterly alone. She had no close family and few friends who could offer more than emotional support. As the medical bills piled up, she quickly realized that there was no way she could even afford to give her father a proper burial. The weight of her grief and financial despair was too much to bear. And that's when Jonathan Carter entered her life. Jonathan had been a business associate of her father's, a man she had met only a handful of times at corporate dinners and events. Even then, she had sensed something predatory about him. He was wealthy, powerful, and always watching her with lingering stares that made her uncomfortable. When he approached her at her father's funeral, it had seemed innocent enough at first. He offered his condolences, his words heavy with the promise of assistance. But soon, his true intentions became clear. Emma had been sitting in her tiny apartment one rainy afternoon, staring at the pile of unpaid bills on the table, when Jonathan showed up unannounced. His presence was imposing, filling the small space with an air of intimidation. He sat across from her, his eyes cold and calculating as he laid out his proposition. "I can make all of this go away," Jonathan had said, his voice smooth and filled with false sympathy. "The debt, the funeral costs. Everything." But, he leaned forward, his gaze piercing her as if he already knew what her answer would be. "There's a price." At first, Emma didn't understand what he was asking. But as Jonathan's true offer became clear, her heart sank. He would pay off all her debts, take care of every penny she owed, but in return, she had to agree to marry him. Not out of love or companionship, but as his trophy wife, a living, breathing accessory to his powerful image. Worse, he insinuated that her father's tragic accident might not have been an accident at all, suggesting that he had powerful connections who could make accidents happen, or prevent them. He implied that refusing him could lead to more unfortunate consequences. Disgusted and terrified, Emma initially resisted. The thought of being married to a man like Jonathan, a man who seemed to relish control, made her skin crawl. But Jonathan was persistent, and the threat of what he could do to her, or to others she cared about, loomed over her like a dark cloud. With no other options, and the fear of his potential retribution, Emma reluctantly agreed to his terms. The marriage was more of a business transaction than a union of love, and over the years, she learned the full extent of Jonathan's cruelty and possessiveness. Fast forward to the present day, and Emma was now trapped in a gilded cage. Jonathan had bought her freedom from financial ruin, but in exchange, she had given up her autonomy. Her dreams of becoming an artist were long forgotten, and her once vibrant spirit was crushed beneath the weight of Jonathan's suffocating control. But then, something unexpected had happened. Emma met Liam Parker. It was at the hospital where she volunteered once a week, a brief escape from the oppressive life she led at Jonathan's side. Liam worked there as an ambulance driver, and they had crossed paths on several occasions. At first, their interactions had been brief, polite greetings exchanged in passing, but over time, their conversations grew longer, more meaningful. Liam was everything Jonathan wasn't. He was kind, humble, and selfless, with a deep sense of compassion that resonated with Emma. He had a way of listening that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The more they talked, the more Emma found herself drawn to him, not because he was flashy or wealthy, but because he made her feel like she mattered. Their bond deepened during a particularly difficult day at the hospital. Emma had just finished a shift, emotionally drained from comforting patients and dealing with the stress of her home life. Liam had found her sitting in the staff break room, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Without a word, he sat down beside her and offered her a modest bouquet of daisies, her favorite flowers. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Emma. In that moment, she felt an emotional connection to Liam, a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. But as their friendship grew, so did Emma's guilt. She knew that Jonathan would never tolerate even the slightest hint of affection for another man. Jonathan treated Emma like a possession, and the idea that she could care for someone else would drive him into one of his terrifying rages. And so, Emma kept her feelings for Liam hidden, even from herself at times, terrified of the consequences if Jonathan ever found out. Jonathan Carter was not the type of man to tolerate disobedience, let alone betrayal. He had always prided himself on being in control of every situation, every person, every aspect of his life. To him, Emma was just another acquisition, a possession he could manipulate, control, and flaunt. She had served her purpose well enough, obedient and quiet, but now, these photographs had disrupted the calm facade he had built. The idea that she could have developed feelings for another man ignited a dangerous fire in him, and Jonathan was not a man who forgave or forgot. After Emma confessed that the man in the photos was Liam Parker, an ambulance driver from the hospital where she volunteered, Jonathan's fury only deepened. How dare she even consider a life with someone so beneath them? His mind raced with vengeful thoughts, calculating how he would not only put an end to this affair, but also destroy Liam in the process. An ambulance driver? Jonathan had sneered after Emma's confession. How precious. And what exactly did you think you two lovebirds could have together, Emma? A life of poverty? A life where you live in a cramped apartment, scrounging for pennies? You'll never have what I've given you. His tone was dripping with condescension and cruelty. Emma, trembling, had no answer for him. The truth was, she didn't want Jonathan's wealth or his mansion. She didn't care about the luxury or the material things that he flaunted as symbols of his power. What she longed for was the one thing Jonathan could never give her: love, kindness, and freedom. Seeing her silence, Jonathan's face contorted in rage, and he grabbed her by the wrist, his grip like iron. You think I'm going to let this slide? You think I'll just sit by while you humiliate me like this? Emma tried to pull away, but Jonathan yanked her close until they were face to face. His voice lowered to a dangerous whisper. I'm going to make sure this ends, Emma. I'm going to make sure he regrets ever looking at you. The venom in his words sent chills down her spine. In the days that followed, Jonathan's plan of vengeance began to take shape. He had always known how to manipulate people, how to bend the world to his will through money, connections, and sheer ruthlessness. He had access to people who could get things done, people who owed him favors. And with his immense wealth, there was little he couldn't accomplish if he put his mind to it. Jonathan wasted no time setting his plan in motion. His goal was not just to end the relationship between Emma and Liam, it was to destroy Liam completely. He wanted to ensure that this lowly ambulance driver would never pose a threat to his control over Emma again. For Jonathan, this was about power, reasserting his dominance over Emma and proving to himself that no one, especially not someone as insignificant as Liam Parker, could cross him and get away with it. With a few phone calls, Jonathan contacted people in high places, corrupt officials, dirty cops, and anyone else willing to do his bidding for the right price. He began laying the groundwork for a setup that would not only ruin Liam's life, but would make it impossible for him to escape the consequences. Liam, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, continued his work at the hospital, carrying on his day-to-day life with quiet integrity. He had no idea that he had crossed paths with a man as vindictive and dangerous as Jonathan Carter. To him, Emma was someone special, a woman who had shown him kindness and warmth, but he never imagined that simply caring for her could lead to the chaos that was about to unfold. One evening, just as Liam was finishing his shift at the hospital, the police arrived. They marched into the emergency room with an air of authority, their uniforms spotless and their expressions stern. Without warning, they approached Liam and handcuffed him in front of everyone, his colleagues, patients, and friends. "You're under arrest for possession and trafficking of illegal narcotics," one of the officers said coldly as he tightened the cuffs around Liam's wrists. Liam stared at them, stunned. "What? There's been a mistake." "I don't." "There's no mistake," the officer cut him off. "We have a warrant to search your vehicle. Step outside." Confused and panicked, Liam complied, his mind racing. He had never been involved in anything illegal. How could this be happening? As they escorted him to the parking lot, a sinking feeling took hold of his gut. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he feared the worst. The officers opened the back of the ambulance Liam had been using, and to his horror, they uncovered bags of illegal drugs, enough to charge him with serious felony offenses. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them pull out the evidence, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. He had never seen those drugs before. But the evidence was there, and it was damning. He tried to explain, tried to protest, but the police weren't interested in his denials. They already had what they needed, and soon enough, Liam found himself being dragged into the back of a police cruiser, his life crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, back at the penthouse, Jonathan received the news with satisfaction. His plan had worked flawlessly. He had used his wealth and influence to plant the drugs in Liam's ambulance, ensuring that the evidence against him was airtight. And now, with Liam behind bars, Jonathan could relish in his victory. Emma, however, was left devastated when she heard the news. Her friend Charlotte, a nurse at the hospital, had called her in a panic. "Emma, you need to come to the hospital right now. It's Liam, he's been arrested." Emma's knees buckled as Charlotte's words echoed in her mind. "Arrested? For what?" "They're saying he was trafficking drugs, Emma. They found bags of narcotics in his ambulance. It's all over the place. They're taking him away." The phone slipped from Emma's hand as a wave of nausea overtook her. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was Jonathan's doing. He had orchestrated this entire thing, to punish her, to punish Liam for daring to care about her. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of it all came crashing down. Jonathan had won. He had destroyed Liam's life, and there was nothing Emma could do to stop it. She rushed to the hospital, her heart racing as she entered the cold, sterile waiting room. The reality of what had just happened hit her hard. Jonathan's revenge was more brutal than she had ever anticipated. Liam was innocent, but that didn't matter. Jonathan's wealth and influence meant that Liam's fate was all but sealed. He would be convicted, and there was nothing Emma could do to save him. Days later, the charges against Liam were announced publicly. Drug trafficking. A felony that carried a minimum of 25 years in prison. Liam was thrown into a world of legal battles, court appearances, and devastating accusations, all fabricated by Jonathan's vendetta. Emma could hardly breathe, knowing that this was her fault, knowing that Jonathan had used her as the weapon to ruin the life of the man she truly loved. 5 long years had passed since the day Emma Hartley was dragged out of court in handcuffs, convicted as an accessory to Liam Parker's alleged drug trafficking crimes. Even now, as she walked through the cold, empty corridors of City Hospital where she worked as a janitor, the weight of her past clung to her like a dark shadow, never allowing her to forget what had happened. Her once bright, hopeful eyes had dulled, and her youthful appearance had withered into one of premature aging. The vibrant artist she had once been was a distant memory, buried under years of hardship and despair. The years in prison had taken everything from her, her dignity, her future, and most devastatingly, her hope. Emma had always been strong, but prison was a place designed to break people. It had nearly broken her. She had served her sentence in silence, numbed by the overwhelming guilt and loss she carried. Every day behind bars had been a reminder of the injustice that had befallen both her and Liam, and of the life they could have had if not for Jonathan Carter's monstrous betrayal. She still remembered the day of her trial as if it were yesterday. Jonathan had used every connection, every resource at his disposal, to ensure she was implicated alongside Liam. The charges were as false for her as they had been for Liam, but Jonathan's wealth and influence ensured that truth didn't matter. Emma had been painted as the willing accomplice to Liam's supposed drug operation, a claim that had horrified her, yet one she could do nothing to refute. The system was rigged against her from the start. The judge had shown no mercy. Emma had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Liam had been given a staggering 25-year sentence for drug trafficking. The day she was taken away, she had screamed for justice, pleaded for someone to listen, but her cries fell on deaf ears. Jonathan had sat in the back of the courtroom, watching with cold satisfaction as the woman he had once claimed to love was led away, his victory complete. Once inside the prison walls, Emma quickly learned that there was no place for hope. It was a harsh environment filled with women who had also been crushed by the system, many of whom had become hardened by their circumstances. Emma had kept to herself, trying to survive each day in a state of emotional numbness. Her only solace had been the occasional letters from Charlotte, her friend from the hospital, who had never stopped believing in her innocence. But even Charlotte's kind words could not pierce the thick veil of hopelessness that had settled over Emma's heart. When her 5 years were finally up, Emma emerged from prison a changed woman. The bright future she had once envisioned was gone. No prestigious art school or career opportunity would ever accept her now, not with a criminal record hanging over her like a curse. Instead, she found herself back at the very place where her life had fallen apart, City Hospital. Only now, she was no longer a volunteer helping patients. She was a janitor, scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, and wiping away the remnants of the life she had once known. Her hands, once used to create delicate brushstrokes on canvas, were now rough and calloused from years of hard labor. Her hair, once long and lustrous, had grown thin and gray, far too soon for her age. The sparkle in her eyes had long since faded, replaced by a weariness that only those who have suffered true injustice can understand. Yet, despite everything, she still came to work every day, not because she had any grand aspirations, but because she had no other choice. This was her life now, a life of quiet resignation. One particularly cold and dreary afternoon, Emma found herself in the hospital's bathroom, scrubbing the tiles with a determination that bordered on obsessive. She focused on the grout between the tiles, trying to remove stains that had long since set in, as if somehow erasing the grime could cleanse her own soul. Her movements were methodical, almost robotic, as she worked to block out the memories that threatened to consume her. It was then that she heard the commotion. The bathroom door burst open, and a team of paramedics rushed in, wheeling a bloodied, battered body on a stretcher. Emma looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. The man on the stretcher was in bad shape, his clothes tattered and his face barely recognizable beneath the dirt and dried blood. One of the medics, his voice urgent, shouted, "Hit by a car downtown. No ID. No pulse." Emma's heart raced as she watched the paramedics work. They transferred the man onto the cold, hard floor of the hospital bathroom, trying to revive him. But something about the man drew Emma in. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something hauntingly familiar about him. She took a step closer, her eyes widening as realization dawned. It was Liam. Even after all these years, despite the grime and blood, Emma knew it was him. His face, though ravaged by time and hardship, was unmistakable. A rush of emotion surged through her as she pushed her way past the paramedics, ignoring their protests. "Let me try something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. Before anyone could stop her, Emma knelt beside Liam's lifeless body. She tilted his head back, her hands trembling as she pinched his nose shut and sealed her lips over his. She breathed into his lungs, once, twice, with every ounce of strength she had left in her tired body. "Come on, Liam," she whispered between breaths, her voice cracking with desperation. "Don't you dare leave me again." The paramedic stood by, watching in stunned silence as this weathered woman, a janitor in ragged clothing, fought with everything she had to bring the man back to life. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and for a moment, Emma feared it was too late, that she had lost him all over again. But then, miraculously, Liam's body convulsed. A guttural wheeze escaped his lips, and his chest rose as his lungs filled with air. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dazed, but alive. Emma gasped, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks as she cupped his whiskered face. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "It's me, Emma. You're alive." Liam's eyes, still cloudy from the trauma, flickered with recognition. His lips parted, but only a faint croak escaped. Emma could feel the weight of the years between them, the years they had lost to Jonathan's cruelty, to the injustice that had torn their lives apart. But none of that mattered now. Liam was alive, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a flicker of hope. One of the paramedics finally regained his composure and stepped forward, pulling Emma gently away from Liam. "Ma'am, do you know this man?" Emma nodded, swiping at the tears that continued to fall. "Yes," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. We have a history. A long one." As the paramedics worked to stabilize Liam and transfer him to a hospital room, Emma stood by, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe it. After all these years, after everything they had been through, fate had brought Liam back into her life. It was a cruel twist of destiny, but also a miraculous one. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain, she wasn't going to lose him again. As she watched Liam being wheeled away, her thoughts drifted back to the dark years of her life, the years of suffering and injustice. But now, standing in that cold, Emma stood outside Liam's hospital room, staring through the small window at the man who had been at the center of her world for so long. His chest rose and fell steadily now, his breathing calm, but the bruises and cuts on his face told the story of years of hardship, years she had tried so hard to forget. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to the cold glass. After all this time, she had found him again, but her heart was heavy with the weight of their shared past. The questions churned in her mind: how had he survived? What had his life been like in the years since Jonathan's cruel scheme tore them apart? And most importantly, could they ever reclaim what they had lost? A soft voice broke through Emma's thoughts. "Emma?" Startled, Emma turned to see Dr. Michael Reynolds, the head of City Hospital's board, standing a few feet away. He was a tall, imposing figure, his graying hair neatly combed, and his suit impeccable as always. But his eyes, normally stern and authoritative, were filled with a kind of warmth and recognition that took Emma by surprise. "Dr. Reynolds," she replied softly, instinctively brushing her hand over her worn janitor's uniform, embarrassed by her disheveled appearance. "I didn't expect to see you." A small smile tugged at the corners of Dr. Reynolds' lips. "I didn't expect to find you here, either," he said. "But I suppose life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." He stepped closer, his gaze lingering on Liam through the window. "Is he a friend of yours?" Dr. Reynolds asked gently. Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. We have a history," she whispered, struggling to find the words. "A long one." Dr. Reynolds seemed to sense the depth of her unspoken pain, and for a moment, he was silent. Then, after a brief hesitation, he spoke again. "You know, I've never forgotten what you did for my family all those years ago." Emma blinked, confused. "Your family?" Dr. Reynolds' eyes softened as he recalled the memory. "You may not remember, but years ago, when you were a volunteer here, you helped my mother during an emergency childbirth. I wasn't in town, but I remember the stories. The doctors had given up hope, but you didn't. You stayed with her, calmed her down, and helped her through the labor. You saved both her and my baby brother's lives that day." Emma's mind raced back, trying to place the memory. It had been so long ago, back when she was full of hope and energy, before Jonathan's control had consumed her life. But slowly, the memory surfaced, the frantic night in the delivery room, the screams of a terrified woman, and the surge of determination Emma had felt to keep her calm and safe. It was a small act of kindness in the grand scheme of things, but it had stuck with her. Dr. Reynolds' smile grew warmer. "I've always wanted to thank you in person, but life gets in the way, doesn't it?" He paused, his gaze becoming more serious. "But now, I see you here, and I can't help but wonder what brought you back to this place, working as a janitor." Shame crept into Emma's voice. "Life happened," she whispered. "And, not in the way I expected." Dr. Reynolds' eyes filled with concern. "Emma, if there's something you need to tell me, something I can help with, I'm here to listen." Emma hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spent so many years hiding the truth, afraid to speak up, terrified of Jonathan's reach even after his death. But now, standing in front of Dr. Reynolds, a man who owed her nothing yet was offering her compassion, she felt an overwhelming urge to unburden herself. Taking a deep breath, Emma began to tell him everything. She spoke of Jonathan's manipulation, how he had coerced her into marrying him after her father's death. She explained how Jonathan had framed Liam, planting drugs in his ambulance and using his wealth and connections to send them both to prison. She told Dr. Reynolds about the trial, about the 5 years she had spent behind bars for a crime she didn't commit, and about how Liam had been sentenced to 25 years, a sentence that had destroyed their lives. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she recounted the horrors of her past, but Dr. Reynolds never interrupted. He listened intently, his expression growing darker and more horrified with each passing moment. When Emma finished, she felt as if a great weight had been lifted off her chest. But at the same time, she feared Dr. Reynolds' response. Would he believe her? Would he dismiss her story as the ramblings of a broken woman? To her relief, Dr. Reynolds' expression was one of empathy, not skepticism. "My God, Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. What you've been through, it's beyond anything anyone should have to endure." Emma wiped at her tears, her hands shaking. "It's over now," she said softly, though her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Jonathan's dead. There's nothing anyone can do." Dr. Reynolds' jaw clenched, and for the first time, Emma saw a flash of anger in his usually calm demeanor. "That man may be dead," he said, his voice hard, "but his crimes are not. And if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that justice, no matter how long delayed, must be served." Emma looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Dr. Reynolds placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm going to help you, Emma. We're going to clear your name, and we're going to clear Liam's too. This injustice cannot stand." Emma stared at him in disbelief. After so many years of suffering, could it really be possible? Could she and Liam finally be free of the nightmare that had consumed their lives for so long? But Dr. Reynolds wasn't finished. "There's someone I think you should meet," he said, leading Emma down the hall. "She's the best attorney in the state, and more importantly, she believes in fighting for the underdog." As they approached the hospital's conference room, Dr. Reynolds opened the door, revealing a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, exuding confidence and authority. Emma felt a wave of recognition as she realized who the woman was. "This is my mother, Elaine Jarvis," Dr. Reynolds said with a smile. "She's also a renowned attorney and has been a fierce advocate for justice her entire career." Elaine stepped forward, extending her hand to Emma. "I've heard a lot about you, Emma," she said warmly. "Michael's told me everything. And I'm here to make sure you and Liam get the justice you deserve." For the first time in years, hope flickered in Emma's heart. She shook Elaine's hand, feeling the strength of the older woman's grip, and realized that perhaps, finally, there was a way out of the darkness. Elaine wasted no time in getting to work. Within days, she had gathered a team of investigators and legal experts to re-examine the evidence from Emma and Liam's original trial. Using her extensive network of contacts, she began uncovering the web of corruption Jonathan had used to orchestrate their downfall. It wasn't easy. Jonathan's influence had been far-reaching, and many of the people involved in framing Liam were still in positions of power. But Elaine was relentless, and she quickly found cracks in the case. The first major breakthrough came when one of the police officers who had been involved in Liam's arrest confessed to planting the drugs in the ambulance. Under pressure from Elaine's team, he admitted that he had been paid off by Jonathan to ensure that Liam was convicted. His confession was damning, and it opened the door for more witnesses to come forward. Piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Elaine uncovered forged documents, falsified evidence, and witness tampering, all orchestrated by Jonathan to destroy Liam and Emma. The corruption ran deep, but Elaine's team was determined to expose it all. As the legal battle intensified, Emma found herself both hopeful and terrified. She spent hours at Liam's bedside, waiting for him to regain full consciousness, praying that when he did, they could finally start rebuilding their lives. But the process was slow. Liam's injuries had been severe, and though he was improving, he still had a long road to recovery. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the case, and soon, Emma and Liam's story was making headlines. Reporters swarmed the hospital, eager for interviews, but Emma kept her distance, refusing to speak to the press until the case was resolved. In the midst of the legal battle, a shocking development occurred. Jonathan's estate was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. After his death in the explosion at his mansion, it was revealed that Jonathan had died without any legal heirs or a written will. As a result, his vast fortune, worth over $2 billion, was legally awarded to Emma as his surviving spouse. The news sent shockwaves through the city. After 2 decades of torment, Emma had not only survived, but had inherited the wealth of the very man who had tried to destroy her. It was an ironic twist of fate, a form of cosmic restitution that neither Emma nor Liam had ever expected. At first, Emma was overwhelmed by the news. She had never wanted Jonathan's money. In fact, she had spent years wishing for nothing more than to be free from his control. But now, with billions of dollars in her name, she realized that this wealth could be used for something far greater than herself. Together with Elaine and Dr. Reynolds, Emma decided to use the money to fund legal aid for those wrongfully convicted, people like her and Liam who had been crushed by a corrupt system. It was her way of ensuring that Jonathan's ill-gotten fortune would be used for good, rather than perpetuating the cycle of injustice. 2 weeks later, the headlines blared with even more startling news: Emma Hartley and Liam Parker fully exonerated. All charges dropped. The legal battle was over, and justice had finally prevailed. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Emma stood on the balcony of her new home, the sprawling Rockingham estate that now, ironically, belonged to her. The estate had once been Jonathan's symbol of wealth and power, a gilded cage where she had been trapped, controlled, and humiliated. But now, it was different. The air felt lighter, the rooms brighter. What had once been a house filled with torment was now a sanctuary, a place where she and Liam could finally start over. As she looked out at the lush gardens below, the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a warm, golden glow. The estate had been meticulously renovated and restored over the past several months, each room and hallway transformed into a reflection of the life she and Liam had dreamed of but never thought they would have. The oppressive reminders of Jonathan had been wiped away, replaced with fresh paint, new furniture, and a sense of peace that Emma had never thought possible. It was still surreal to Emma. After decades of hardship and loss, to be standing here, free from the shadow of Jonathan's cruelty, felt almost like a dream. But it was real. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle breeze that carried the scent of flowers from the garden. She could hear the laughter of children playing on the distant lawns, guests from the local orphanage she and Liam had invited to enjoy the estate's vast grounds. The joy in their laughter mirrored the happiness she had finally found, a happiness that had been denied to her for so long. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of footsteps. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "Thinking too much again, are we?" Liam's voice was a comforting presence, steady and warm. Emma smiled, turning to face him. Liam stood in the doorway, looking healthier and more vibrant than he had in years. His once grizzled hair had been trimmed neatly, and though there were still traces of the wear and tear life had put him through, there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, no longer the tattered clothes of a homeless man, but the relaxed attire of someone finally at peace with the world. "I guess I am," Emma admitted, smiling as Liam crossed the room to join her on the balcony. "It's still hard to believe that all of this is real." Liam wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and they stood together, looking out over the garden that stretched out before them. "It's real," he whispered into her hair. "We made it, Emma. After everything we've been through, we're finally here." For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence, just holding each other, letting the weight of their shared past fall away. Emma leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the one constant in her life after so many years of chaos. It had been a long journey to get here, a journey that had nearly destroyed them both, but somehow, they had survived. The news of their exoneration had spread like wildfire. The charges that had once hung over their heads had been dropped, and their names had been cleared. Liam's wrongful conviction was overturned, and Emma's record was wiped clean. The justice system had finally acknowledged the truth, that they had been victims of a monstrous man who had manipulated everything and everyone around him to suit his twisted desires. Jonathan's death had been the final, ironic twist in their story. The explosion that had killed him, tearing apart half of his mansion, had been ruled an accident, a gas leak, the authorities had said. It was as if fate itself had stepped in, removing Jonathan from their lives once and for all, freeing them from his toxic grip. And with his death, Emma had inherited everything. The mansion, the business empire, and a fortune that surpassed $2 billion. At first, Emma hadn't known what to do with the money. The idea of accepting Jonathan's wealth after all he had done to her felt wrong, like some kind of tainted reward for enduring years of abuse. But with Liam's gentle encouragement, she had come to see the money not as a reminder of Jonathan's cruelty, but as a tool for good, a way to build something new, something better. Together, Emma and Liam had decided to put the money to use in ways that would help others, turning Jonathan's ill-gotten gains into a force for positive change. They had established a charitable foundation aimed at providing legal aid to those who had been wrongfully convicted, people like Liam who had been crushed under the weight of corruption and injustice. The foundation had quickly gained attention, with lawyers and advocates across the country reaching out to join the cause. In just a few short months, they had already helped dozens of people find justice. But beyond their philanthropic work, Emma and Liam were focused on building a life together, a life that, for so long, had seemed impossible. They had started simple, enjoying the small pleasures they had been denied for so many years. Morning walks through the gardens, quiet evenings by the fireplace, and long talks about the future they were finally free to plan. And now, today, they were preparing for something even more monumental, their wedding. Emma's heart swelled with emotion at the thought. After all these years, after all the pain and suffering, they were finally going to be husband and wife. The wedding would take place in the garden, under the shade of the old oak tree where Emma had spent so many hours dreaming of freedom. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and a few family members, but it was perfect. Dr. Michael Reynolds, who had played such a crucial role in helping them find justice, would be there, along with his mother, Elaine Jarvis, who had become a close friend and confidant to Emma. As Emma and Liam stood on the balcony, gazing out at the preparations below, they could see the staff setting up the gazebo where the ceremony would be held. The wedding cake, a towering masterpiece decorated with delicate white roses, was already in place, and rows of white chairs were lined up neatly on the lawn. It was a far cry from the grandiose, extravagant weddings Emma had attended in Jonathan's social circle, but that was exactly what made it special. It wasn't about wealth or status, it was about love, about the bond between two people who had fought tooth and nail to be together. "I still can't believe this is really happening," Emma murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Liam squeezed her hand gently. "You deserve this, Emma. We both do. No more suffering, no more fear, just us, together." Emma leaned her head against Liam's shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence soothe her lingering doubts. "I love you," she whispered. "More than words can ever say." Liam tilted her chin up, his eyes full of tenderness. "And I love you, Emma. Forever and always." Their lips met in a soft, loving kiss, the first of many more to come, the kiss that sealed the promise of a future they had fought so hard to reach. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the estate, guests started to gather in the garden. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle sound of classical music played in the background. Emma stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, taking one last look at herself before the ceremony. She wore a simple, elegant gown, nothing too extravagant, just a soft white dress that flowed gracefully around her. Her hair was pinned up in soft curls, with a few delicate flowers woven into the strands. As she stared at her reflection, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. For the first time in years, she felt beautiful, not because of what she was wearing, but because she was free. Free from Jonathan's shadow, free from the prison of her past. There was a knock at the door, and Elaine Jarvis stepped into the room, her face glowing with pride. "You look radiant, Emma," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Liam is a very lucky man." Emma smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude for the woman who had helped her find justice. "Thank you, Elaine. I wouldn't be here without you." Elaine waved off the compliment. "Nonsense. You and Liam earned this happiness. I just helped clear the path." The two women shared a quiet moment of understanding before Elaine reached out and took Emma's hand. "It's time," she said softly. Nodding, Emma took a deep breath and followed Elaine out of the room. Together, they walked down the grand staircase, out through the doors, and into the garden where the ceremony awaited. The sight that greeted her took Emma's breath away. The garden was bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, and the gazebo was adorned with soft white fabric and flowers. Friends and family sat in neat rows, their faces glowing with happiness and love. At the front, under the oak tree, stood Liam, his eyes locked on her as she walked toward him. He looked every bit as handsome as he had the day they met, though now, his face was filled with the kind of peace and contentment that only comes from surviving the worst life has to offer. As Emma reached the front, she took Liam's hands in hers, and together, they turned to face the officiant. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with vows that spoke not only of love, but of resilience, of the strength they had found in each other through years of hardship. When the officiant finally said the words they had been waiting for, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the crowd erupted in applause, and Emma and Liam shared their first kiss as a married couple. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, music, and joy. Guests danced under the stars, the garden filled with light and life, and for the first time in years, Emma felt truly at peace. The nightmare was finally over. She and Liam were free to live the life they had always dreamed of, a life filled with love, happiness, and the promise of a bright future. As the night drew to a close, Emma and Liam stood together under the oak tree, watching the last of the guests depart. The garden was quiet now, the only sound the rustle of the leaves in the breeze. Emma leaned into Liam's side, her heart full. "We made it," she whispered. Liam kissed the top of her head, his arms wrapped around her. "Yes, we did. And now, we have the rest of our lives to enjoy." And with that, they turned and walked back toward the house, hand in hand, ready to begin the next chapter of their story, a chapter filled with hope, love, and the freedom to finally be themselves.